So if folks are joining us now, we're just going to give it maybe one more minute as people log on, and we'll get going here. Great. So hello, I'm a little bit blind to you, but hello and welcome everyone to the Trustees Conservation in Action webinar series. My name is Jennifer Corr. I'm the Director of Agriculture here at the Trustees, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And I hope you're really excited to get an in-depth look at how we approach the care of our farms in particular. So each one of our 123 properties here at the Trustees has its own unique history and treasures to offer the public. And our team of stewards, farmers, ecologists, and many others all play a role in caring for these special places. Today, you'll hear about the exceptional work we're doing to advance an agroecological initiative across our farms and our farmland. And these efforts really would not be possible without the support of our donors. So thank you. When the world went virtual, gosh, more than 2 years ago now, we launched these new online programming opportunities like this webinar series in order to stay connected to our members, visitors, and supporters. We've since found that our online webinars help us reach an even broader audience, including many who have gained a renewed appreciation for nature and getting outside. I hope that our time together today will inspire you to get out and explore a trustee's farm, and also helps you to better understand the work that we are doing in agriculture. So please do submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will reserve some time at the end for questions, we promise. Also, next to that Q&A button, you'll see a live transcript option. If you would like to enable closed captions to appear at the bottom of your screen, please select live transcript and then show subtitle. Thank you. So again, my name is Jennifer. I bring a particular background in sustainable development, farm-based experiential learning, and over 20 years of direct farming experience to my role as Director of Agriculture. And today I'm joined by my colleagues Alejandro Brambilla, our new agroecologist, who works very closely with our farm managers in advancing approaches that support both production and conservation values. He also focuses on identifying relevant areas of formal inquiry. Also joining us today is Dr. Julie Richberg, lead ecologist for Inland Natural Resources. Julie has been with our organization for over 16 years, working to ensure the health, diversity, and resilience of our natural habitats. Today, we are going to talk about our Agroecology initiative, which is a significant body of work within the Trustees' agricultural strategy and the overall organizational centering of climate resilience. I'm delighted that today we have the opportunity to review together how that work is taking form. In real terms, we'll examine some of the data that we've collected over this past season and discuss where we're heading this upcoming year and beyond with this work. Julie, Alejandro, and I have had the opportunity to work very closely together over the past year in puzzling out and wrestling with this idea of what an agroecological approach means specifically at a place like the Trustees, and how our positioning as a land resourced organization can contribute practical knowledge of value to producers really across the state and the region, particularly at this moment of unprecedented climate change. As we begin the conversation today, I'd like to start by providing an overview of Trustees' farms and farmland as important working land resources. The Trustees has preserved over 12,000 acres of Massachusetts farmland since our founding in 1891. Included in our portfolio are 5 currently active Trustees production farms. These are places where we serve local markets, we grow field crops organically, and we manage livestock on permanent pasture. Our production farm team is growing on almost 2,000 acres. We raise 100% grass-fed beef and lamb, pastured poultry and pigs for over 500 meat shares, and we grow mixed organic vegetables, herbs, flowers, and field fruits for over 1,200 households through our on-farm CSA programs. We also grow certified organic produce for our mobile market food access program. This production activity happens at Appleton Farms in Hamilton and Ipswich. So Appleton is one of the oldest continuously operating farms in the US. At Chestnut Hill Farm, which is the last working farm in Southborough, Weir River Farm, a hillside farm in Hingham, Howisit Farm in Dover, and Moose Hill Farm in Sharon. So those are our 5 production farms. Importantly, as an organization, we also lease additional farmland within our portfolio to individual farmers and agricultural organizations across the state. This further contributes to the preservation of the agrarian landscape and the local economy while ensuring access to farmland for producers. One example includes our land partnership with Nuestras Raíces in Holyoke. Located on the shores of the Connecticut River, La Finca is a 25-acre urban farm at the heart of Nuestras Raíces' work to build a just food system, boost economic development, and produce specialty cultural crops for the Latinx community. Trustees production farms and farmland account for thousands of acres across the state. The work that we do in the coming years to define our farmland management standards and trial new production practices in a changing climate has deeply impactful potential across the entire state of Massachusetts and the region. So I want to ensure that we all share an understanding of what we're talking about when we say agroecology. For me, it's helpful to think about this as a framework that emerges when we formally combine the craft of production farming with the science of ecology. So if we think of the craft of farming as the skill in creating food from the land, the decision-making that's required around sort of managing practices and problem solving on a daily basis, reading natural resources and building those resources that shape production over time. And then we overlay the scientific study of relationships between living organisms, their habitats, and the various interdependent ecosystems. We have an agroecological approach. This is fundamentally not a new concept. In fact, Indigenous agriculture really centered many of these principles of producing food within the confines of natural ecosystems. And agroecology really fits into an overarching umbrella of sustainable agricultural movements and approaches that have emerged in response in many ways to the Green Revolution, which began in the 1950s and 60s. These include organic, biodynamic, regenerative, and permaculture, among others, each really building on and reacting to the shortcomings of the other, and almost all drawing in some ways on Indigenous knowledge and practices. It's important to understand that all working farms are agroecosystems, where agricultural production relies on and impacts the broader ecosystem. At the Trustees, we're particularly focused on practices that enhance productivity and climate resilience by building soil, maintaining biodiversity, supporting pollinators, and ensuring a high annual and perennial crop quality and yield. Our agroecology initiative represents a significant shift for us in 2 important ways. One is sort of reconciling what can otherwise be competing interests or priorities. In fact, the norm in this space is typically to declare acreage, either production farmland or land for ecological conservation. And what we're trying to do here is determine where land can be both and name and fully understand the functional trade-offs when we must choose one over the other. And secondly, This work transforms our production farms into living laboratories where we can trial specific practices within the very real constraints of production operations. So how do we do that? Our agroecology work really leverages our farmland to quite boldly ask questions about and further define emerging climate-smart farming practices. Really, there are hundreds of ways to misalign theory and practice when it comes to farming, and most producers cannot afford to shoulder the risk to discover the practices that work. As a farmland resourced organization, the trustees is able to ask these questions and identify viable emerging best practices. We have identified 4 intersecting priority areas. These include building soil, so over time as measured through changing soil health indicators. Building soil structure and reducing soil disturbance really helps increase soil organic matter. It increases carbon sequestration, improves water holding capacity, and supports a diversity of microbial life. All of these things increase crops' resilience in a changing climate. Open grasslands and field margins provide a prime opportunity to support native pollinators that are beneficial both to natural and agricultural systems. By increasing the availability of floral resources, host plants, and nest sites throughout the year, we can actively support these native pollinators. And then grazing management and forage availability. So alternative livestock feed strategies, including things like stockpiling grass and establishing native warm season grasses or feeding alternative tree fodders, all have the potential to help overcome increasing challenges to feed availability and improve managed grazing productivity and ecosystem services. And finally, planting more perennial crops, including vegetables, herbs, flowers, fruits, and nuts, which contribute to permanent soil cover and deep rooting. These can help farms adapt to climate change by improving soil health and diversifying production, as well as help to mitigate through maximized carbon sequestration. The findings from trials that evaluate viability, measure labor and maintenance requirements, input costs, and then relative outcomes are critically important to the entire community of relatively small-scale local producers who dominate the New England agrarian landscape. And one final point before I hand it off to Julie, the systems and practices that are employed by farmers here, there, everywhere in the world impact the local ecosystem and collectively the planet. So achieving outcomes is directly correlated to practice choices. On our production farms here, we're engaged in a series of practices that are intended to support soil building, enhance climate resiliency, improve yield and quality, and support biodiversity and water quality. But what happens if we ask really specific questions, we tweak our practices, and then we collect the resulting data? Do the outcomes change in specific and measurable ways? That is the body of work that we are building out within this agroecology initiative, inquiring, learning, and sharing those learnings. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Julie, who's going to talk to us about habitats and natural resources tied to farmland management.
Thank you very much, Jen. And if you can advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I am so excited about our agroecology work and having the opportunity to work with Jen and Alejandro. It is, I've been with the organization, as Jen was saying, it'll be 17 years this spring, and this is just such an exciting time to have our ecology team and our agriculture team working so closely as we're addressing climate change, local food, and habitat management. So I focus on the inland natural resources. I'm part of our coast and natural resources team, and our team focuses on our natural habitats, including forests, wetlands, and grassland habitats across all of our properties. Looking at biodiversity, resiliency of our lands to climate change, carbon sequestration, and the ecosystem services that our lands provide, including clean water, air to breathe, pollinators that we need for our crops, and even habitat for wildlife. Next slide, please. The trustees protect hundreds of rare species across our properties. Species like the peregrine falcon and box turtle here, as well as many plant species, lady's tresses, orchids, wall rue, ferns, and even within some of our farms, we have rare species that we're protecting, even in actively grazed fields. Next slide, please. Of course, for the intersection between ecology and our agriculture team, field habitats are kind of where it's at, and looking at how we manage our open fields. All of our grasslands across the state, almost all, are what we consider cultural habitats. So they're actively managed by us, by humans over the generations, but they're also providing key habitat for native species, such as grassland breeding birds like bobolinks here, rare species of plants, sedges, orchids, the iris here, Iris prismatica. And if we didn't maintain these habitats through our practices, our management practices, whether that's having our stewardship teams mow the fields or having the fields hayed by a farmer that we're leasing the fields out to, or doing this work ourselves, these habitats would return to forested habitats. So it's really important for us to maintain these and do the work to keep these landscapes open, to provide for these species and have biodiversity for Massachusetts. This is kind of the cornerstone of some of our agroecology work, where we actually have to work in conjunction with active management to provide habitats for biodiversity. And Alejandro will be speaking a lot more about this coming up. But I also wanted to highlight a couple of other activities that we do within the inland ecology team. Next slide, please, Jen. Where we're also addressing habitat improvement and management of field habitats throughout the state. Some of these are on our active farms, but some are not on our active farms, such as this example of pollinator habitat improvement project that we're have kicked off last year for World's End. We're looking at over 100 acres of open fields at World's End, and we have gotten support from the Natural Resources Conservation Service to improve pollinator habitats across these fields. Over time, the fields have become, depending on their management, whether they're managed for hay fields or just kept open for scenic vistas or just mowed periodically, have become degraded. They've become invaded by non-native invasive species. They're succeeding in some areas with woody species coming in. They've become overgrown with some native species of vines, such as poison ivy. And we've lost some of our native biodiversity of plants, and those are directly impacting the invertebrate resources that are out there. And so we are working over the next 4 years to improve this habitat at World's End, doing invasive plant control, reintroducing native wildflowers, and managing these habitats so that they can fulfill our ecological priorities. Alejandro will dig deeper into some of the collaborative work with our hayfields but leave it to say, this is an exciting project, and hopefully you'll be able to see some of these pollinators the next time you come out to visit World's End. Next slide, please, Jen. On the other hand, we also do restoration and resiliency projects. So looking at creating more resiliency in our natural habitats to climate change, restoring subhabitats that may have been changed over the years. So out at Bartholomew's Cobble in 2013, we returned a field habitat back to a forest habitat. So we're actually, as I mentioned earlier about our cultural grasslands and those requiring our management to keep them open, or they would return to forest. At Bartholomew's Cobble out in the Berkshires, right along the Housatonic River, we have a significant floodplain forest resource there, which is helping with climate resiliency. It slows the floodwaters of the Housatonic. It's extremely biodiverse with numerous rare species. And previous to the trustees owning the property, there were sections of the floodplain forest that had been cleared for agriculture. And with our floodplain forest restoration project, we actually took 10 acres of fields and are returning that to floodplain forest for climate change resiliency, increased carbon sequestration, and again, improving the biodiversity and natural habitats of one of our properties. So in my role as the ecologist, we're looking at both sides of the coin. Where are those fields that we need to keep open, as well as are there fields that we can return to a forested condition? So with that, I will hand it off to Alejandro to talk more specifically about some of the work we've been doing together.
Thanks, Jennifer and Julie. This has been a really exciting first year. It's been great working with these two teams with so much experience and expertise. And I'm really happy for the opportunity to share what we've been up to and where we're going. I'm going to start by discussing some steps we've taken to move forward our work, bridging the trustees' agriculture and ecology goals on the farms we manage. I'll continue with how we've been monitoring the progress we've made towards these goals, and I'll finish with some examples of trials and interventions that will be taking place in 2023 and beyond. Next. So I want to start off by talking through a model of how I've been thinking about how our agricultural and ecological values relate. As Jennifer said, outcomes depend on practice, and across our farms, we're working to better identify where we can adjust practices to improve these outcomes. Next. So at its most basic, the primary goal of farming is to produce food. So agricultural success is often measured in yields. While it's pretty obvious, an example of how farming practices directly affect production is that, for example, you can till a field to reduce competition, leading to higher yields. Next. However, any practice has impacts beyond short-term yields, and these are often mediated by changes to our resource base or environment. In our example, tillage can lead to soil erosion, eventually having a net negative impact on food production. Conscientious agricultural practices sustain or regenerate these resources, ensuring resilience and long-term productivity. Next. A similar pattern exists for ecosystem outcomes, where farming practices can have positive or negative effects. Here again, we could consider the impact that tillage and erosion have on plant communities, soil life, or stream health. At the same time, agriculture has high potential to support ecosystem health, especially in the Northeast, where, as Julie mentioned, conserved non-forested land is limited and fragmented. So in this context, carefully managed farmland has an important role to play in supporting specialized plant and animal communities. Next. Finally, a healthy ecosystem feeds directly back to food production in so many ways, including plant nutrition, pollination, and pest control. Next. As a team, we've been working towards understanding what specific outcomes we're interested in, both as farmers and ecologists, through a farm inventory process. And during this process, we've identified key values and concerns we want to manage for across our farm properties. Some of those are highlighted here. Often these are the same for farmers and ecologists, as is the case with soil health or climate resilience. Sometimes there's potential for trade-offs, as can be the case with managing for grassland birds. And sometimes we can make progress simply by incorporating new sources of information into our decision-making process. For example, if livestock managers know where there's a patch of rare plants, these can often be avoided with little cost. Next. Another example of how our inventory process is helping us reach a shared understanding of goals is in relation to weed and invasive species control. In some cases, agricultural and ecological perspectives are aligned on what species need to be controlled, and in other cases, there can be a disconnect. So for example, multiflora rose on the left is one of our most problematic invasive species and field weeds, while on the other hand, common milkweed is an important host plant for the specialized monarch butterfly, but is generally unpalatable to livestock and can form dense clonal stands if not managed carefully. We also have different strengths and abilities to address the problem of managing an undesirable species, and we're working on a collaborative invasive species management approach to work together more directly and effectively. Next. To evaluate our progress towards these shared agroecological priorities, we're developing a set of monitoring protocols to be applied across our farms at the field level. This effort builds upon an existing monitoring and evaluation system that's been carried out by the ecology team over several years, as well as farm records and a comprehensive soil health monitoring program started by the farm team in 2021. Over the course of 2022, we worked to expand both what is measured and where it is measured across the farm. While this has largely taken place at Appleton Farms, in the coming years, we'll be expanding our monitoring across our 5 trustees managed production farms. And I'm going to just walk through a few examples from that now. Next. So as I mentioned, we conducted a comprehensive soil health monitoring program in 2021 with provisions to keep adding data every 3 years. And the goal of this program is to see how our practices affect soil health over time and how that soil health affects our farming success. On the right, we can see Appleton Farms showing where several of these samples were taken. And in the meantime, between these 3-year intervals, on a more operational scale, we're taking more basic soil samples and submitting them through UMass Amherst. So the soil health samples are going through the Cornell's CASH program, which looks at more biological activity. And these annual soil samples are looking more at nutrient status, pH, etc. And this year, we both repeated the same points that we took from 2021 or last year, and also expanded upon these points with samples from nearly all of our livestock and crop production fields across all 5 farms. Next. We also measure forage availability across our fields to help understand how productive these fields are over time. This can be a factor of how we use our fields, what the climate and soil conditions are, and also what species are present. So here you can see how the available forage in one field changed over the course of this historic drought year that we just went through. This was actually a particularly wet area that proved to be very valuable to us this year. And because of this seasonal variability, measuring productivity with a time sequence is really important. This information can also help us evaluate when to enter a pasture and how much residual we're leaving behind. Next. The tool that we use to do this is called a rising plate meter. It works by taking several height measurements along a transect, which are then averaged. This average height measurement is then converted to a weight of dry matter per unit area, representing available forage. And while experienced livestock managers can perform this estimation more or less intuitively, taking these measurements allows us to have a useful record of historical data as well. Next. So here you can see, as an example, data collected from 2 of over 60 fields that we measured at Appleton from June through November of 2022. Because we got a late start, what these plots are mostly showing is the effect of grazing or haying followed by that failure to recover during the drought. And in 2023, we'll be expanding this procedure to all 5 farms, supported by our livestock staff, and we'll be starting it as soon as the grass begins to grow in April. Next. So vegetation is also monitored along these same transects every 3 years following ecology protocols. Here you can see Jillian in the background along that transect. Next. This is a really rich data set at the field level, but here's just a snapshot of some highlights at Appleton. So we monitored across 705 vegetation plots across 35 transects. We counted 247 unique species. Our average cover was 81% grass, 30% forbs and legumes, 3% woody vegetation cover. 21% of our plots had invasive forbs in them, with the most common being purple loosestrife, and 4% of our plots had invasive woody vegetation. Again, we see that is a multiflora rose there. This is an average across the whole farm, but at the field level, this information can be used to guide invasive species management, drill seeding decisions for new pasture species, or it can be analyzed alongside soil health and productivity data to better understand patterns. Next. So providing habitat for grassland birds is another of our ecological priorities, and managed carefully during the breeding season, our pastures and hayfields can play this role. So last year at Appleton, we monitored 79 unique points, aiming to repeat each of these points in both the early and late breeding season. At each point, we identified and counted all birds seen and heard over the course of 5 minutes. Also, as Julie mentioned, one of the key grassland birds that we focus on is the bobolink, which is a small bird with a very impressive annual migration to South America, which serves as an indicator for grassland bird habitat and grassland habitat quality generally. During our early season visits, we had observed 68 bobolinks. In the late season, we had 28. While we avoided counting the same birds and adjacent points on the same day, they can be quite mobile, especially towards the end of the season. So these numbers likely overcount the total. We plan to ramp up our grassland bird monitoring efforts this year to get a better idea of when and where the birds are by increasing the frequency of monitoring with both volunteer and livestock staff observations. Next. So while all of these monitoring efforts help us understand how our farming practices impact agricultural and ecological outcomes, the next step we're working to take is to ask how we can adjust our practices in ways that enhance these outcomes. We're currently planning a series of focused trials and experiments that aim to answer specific questions relevant to New England farming and conservation efforts. These trials may be about reducing trade-offs, identifying win-win interventions, building resilience, or simply how to incorporate new types of knowledge to management decisions. Before moving forward, I just want to reiterate what Jennifer had said, that the reason we're able to do this is because our organization holds a privileged position of owning a good amount of farmland. The fact that we have both this excellent farm and ecology staff working together, and that we're able to take risks that would be too large for small family farmers. At the same time, our farm operations must remain viable and are expected to produce a substantial amount of quality food. And this is an important constraint for us because it allows what we learn to be realistic and relevant for real farms. So we've identified several priorities for 2023, including a grassland bird study, pollinator enhancements, and efforts to reduce tillage. Next. But there's a large menu of items that we're excited to tackle over the next few years. I'm not going to go into all of these, but this is just to show that we've made an effort to relate these different trials to our different agriculture and ecological values that we share. Today, I'm just going to focus on one of these, native warm season grasses for forage and wildlife. Next. So native warm season grass pastures are an example of a potential win-win for production and ecology. Here, what we're looking at is an established field of native warm season grasses at Green Acres in Ohio, composed of big bluegrass, little bluegrass, and Indian grass, along with some native wildflowers. Collectively, these grasses are examples of prairie grasses, which would have historically populated our grasslands. The reason that we're considering planting native warm season grasses is that one of the main challenges in managing a rotational grazing scheme for 100% grass-fed beef is dealing with seasonal forage variation. Next. So throughout the Northeast, pastures are dominated by cool season European pasture grasses, as you can see in the inset here, mainly orchard grass and timothy. And even in a normal year, these have seasonal variation in productivity. This means that in the spring, there is often too much grass for cattle to handle, which then becomes overmature, and in the summer, there's not enough. We experienced the downside of having all of our pastures planted with cool season grasses last year during our prolonged drought. Next. Over the summer, as the grass went dormant, as you can see here, we had to feed out hay that we had set aside for winter. While cool season grasses generally have performed well in the Northeast, climate change is complicating this, and their adaptation to European soils and climates also leads to other production challenges around fertility, pH requirements, and moisture challenges. Next. Warm season grasses, by contrast, start growing later and generally reach their peak productivity later in the summer, precisely when these cool season grasses are slowing down. They have root structure and photosynthetic adaptations that make them more resilient to drought. And as they're adapted to local conditions, they're also less dependent on supplemental fertility and pH adjustments to be productive. For these reasons, native warm season grasses have seen increased use in the South and Midwest, but are still largely absent from Northeast farms. As they form the foundation of grassland ecosystems, reestablishing prairie grasses can also improve habitat for various native species like bees, butterflies, small mammals, and birds. One of the reasons for this is how they grow as bunch grasses, providing shelter, leaving open ground for diverse flowering plants. So conservation groups in the Northeast, like Mass Audubon at Allen's Pond, have prioritized restoring these native grasses on protected lands. It's our hope that by demonstrating the potential for warm season forage on our farmland, that we can support and enhance these efforts. Our plan is to start a 3-year process of converting 10 to 20 acres of cool season pasture to native prairie species this fall. And we started by learning from other organizations with experience like Green Acres and Stone Barns. This process involves restricting grazing on the pasture for 1 to 2 years, during which time existing vegetation will be cleared, and then no-till seeding in new grasses, followed by legumes and broadleaf plants the following year. Over the course of this trial and the others, we'll be sharing our successes and failures with the public and other grazing professionals through groups like the Northeast Grazing Network. Thanks, and I look forward to talking more about our other exciting trials in the future.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, Alejandro, and Julie. We are going to open up for some questions now. Again, you can ask those questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we do have a few here. So one, so far, what are opportunities for collaboration and synergies with government, MA Department of Agriculture, or other nonprofits, American Farmland Trust?
That's a great question. I'll start off and then you guys can hop in if you have things to add for sure. So this is a new area in our agricultural strategy at the trustees, and we have been building these relationships over the last year and look forward to continuing to build these relationships. So we did partner with the American Farmland Trust fairly intimately when we did our statewide baseline soil assessment. So that was a really wonderful way to build professional relationships and team up with AFT so they could bring some of their expertise into that project. We also worked with the regenerative design group on that project. And then we are in conversation with the Natural Resource and Conservation Service, part of the USDA. NRCS supports all kinds of conservation activity all over the country. They also have specific sort of farm practice programs, and we are engaged in those programs, but we are looking at ways to partner further with NRCS where our trials can actually help inform some of their approved and promoted practices for conservation. So we're looking at expanding that for sure. So there's a tremendous amount of potential for us to grow this in certain ways. And I just want to return to something that Alejandro said, which is that there are universities, there are sort of doing a lot of research in agriculture. And one of the unique aspects of the trustees engaging in practical trials and then making that information available to producers and the public at large is that we are actual production farms. So where that research happens is within these constraints that will be shared constraints with other farmers across the region and in some ways the country. And I think that's a really valuable contribution that we're going to be able to make here. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
I'll just jump in quickly. I think the trustees have always had a really good relationship with NRCS programs and participating within kind of state activities within NRCS as well. So we have that relationship. The Pollinator habitat management plan that we're instituting out at World's End is really one of the first that NRCS is supporting throughout the state. And we've also been involved with the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation around this work as well. So we are partnering and collaborating with other organizations.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Another question here is, do grassland birds show any preference for warm or cool season grasses?
I guess I'll take that. Yes and no. They're actually more interested in, they seem to be reflective of the habitat conditions. And so they're looking for fields that have, a dense grass, but enough kind of patchiness that they can run along the ground. They're ground nesting birds. So they're looking for that, putting their nest right on the ground. If it's too thick, like a lawn, that's not going to be appropriate. Alejandro mentioned the bunch grasses of the native grasses, but even the European pasture grasses can support the grassland breeding birds. It's really making sure that the grass is there when they need to nest. There's not too much of a thicket underneath the grass, and that there are enough food resources for them as well. So being able to eat the insects and caterpillars that they feed their young. Great question.
Thank you. Are there any databases of Massachusetts soil quality to which we can compare the changes in our property's soil over time?
Also a great question. These are good ones. So there is, NRCS actually has like a soil web map that we can access some information. It tends to be around soil type and less around sort of comprehensive analysis. So I'll just take this opportunity to explain that I think there's been a real surge in sort of soil science evolution in the last 5 to 10 years, in the sense that for a long time, farmers have been testing soil for a long time. We've been looking very much at the chemical component or the nutrient components, right? Are we high? Are we low? What do we need to add by way of amendments? And that has sort of been the beginning and the end of soil health analysis. And now we're at this place where we understand, as a community of producers and the scientific community, that there are all of these other components to soil health, right? So soil health is essentially the ability of soil to function, to do all that we ask of it to do. And so we now are really looking at things like biologicals in the soil. That's a critical component to the functionality of the soil, and the structure of the soil. That's a really important component. So yes, there is information around kind of what soils look like across Massachusetts and ultimately across the country, but there isn't a lot of accessible information around kind of all of the comprehensive details you can get through a comprehensive analysis, which is what we did in our statewide baseline soil assessment. So we now have all of this great baseline data. The other thing about soil is that it doesn't change immediately. Like, you can change your practices over a series of seasons and not see that translate into soil health indicator improvements until you're 5 years into that or longer, right? So this is a long journey, but we at least have better tools for looking at that progress. And I think that's really important and relatively new. Yeah, I'll stop there if anyone has anything else to add.
Yeah, I would just add that, so for example, with the Cornell Cash soil health testing, that obviously they're looking at soil samples that aren't just coming from the trustees. So they have, between those practical examples and the theory around how those tests work, enough context to be able to give us scores on different soil metrics, that so we're not just comparing ourselves to ourselves, but to some objective criteria that does exist.
And I would just jump in as well too, that I believe American Farmland Trust was working on building kind of a more available data set for comparison as well.
Wonderful. Thank you all for that. And I will ask 2 more questions here. So how does the Agroecology initiative affect access to affordable food? For example, will it support community gardens?
That's a great question. So we are focused in this initiative and looking at production farms at a production scale. It doesn't mean that there aren't lessons that could pass over to a gardening level scale, for sure. But really the questions around, is this practice at the field scale going to change things and contribute to the outcomes that we're looking for, right? I will say that our agroecology work doesn't make food more expensive. So in many ways, by the trustees positioning ourselves to ask these questions and to use our farmland to conduct these investigations, we are actually in a position to then pass along those learnings to other producers. And if that improves overall production over time, or has a cost savings component, then ultimately that's good in terms of food access in the region. Do others have things to add? Go ahead, Alejandro.
Yeah, I would just add that a lot of the sorts of methods around agroforestry and working in more marginal lands and activating more marginal lands is really relevant from a either a farm access or food production access on a smaller, more decentralized scale. So a lot of, this is something we talk about often, is that a lot of the best farmland is either already in the hands of large existing farmers or has been developed. So a lot of what's available is more marginal lands that aren't productive under conventional systems. So kind of teasing out some of these alternative methods of production can help increase food access, not just on the production side, but like self-sufficiency side of things as well.
Wonderful. And just time for one more question here today. What are you doing to support pollinators on your farms?
I can just mention a few other things that we're looking forward to here. So I think one really basic thing is that our vegetable operation is fully organic. We're not using any pesticides in our livestock operation either. The work that Julie mentioned at World's End is a really exciting effort to incorporate more flowering plants into our grasslands that I'm really looking forward to see the results from. We also have some trials geared specifically towards pollinators, like establishing hedgerows as windbreaks, adjusting the management of our field edges, and incorporating wildflower plantings. One area that I'm really interested in is leveraging our farms to support the production of locally adapted native seed. This is a huge bottleneck, not just for the interventions we want to carry out at our farm, but for restoration efforts locally and more broadly. Towards that end, I've been talking with Eco59, which is a farmer cooperative seed company in Connecticut that's been building experience growing out wild seed in seeding increase plots that they then sell. And I think we'll be trialing a small plot of our own at one of our farms this year.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much again for doing this wonderful webinar. Jennifer, if you could just close for us today, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again to all of you for joining us today. And please join us next week for a Great Marsh Restoration Project update. For all of these webinar recordings in the series, you can visit the trustees.org/webinars to access them. They're all being recorded. And again, the work you heard about today would really not be possible without our donors, especially top supporters like our Founder Circle members. So if you're not yet a Founder Circle member and you'd like to find out more, learn about this opportunity, please do visit our website or give us a call, and we're happy to chat with you about that. Thank you again for joining us today, for investing in our mission, and for believing in the work that we can do here together.